Education in Educational Psychology and the Director of Assessment. She has multiple visiting professorships in Italy, Spain, Singapore, New Zealand, and Switzerland. She holds her Ph.D. at Rutgers University and 4 master degrees in teaching, clinical and counseling psychology, and Italian language. Her expertise is on cognitive and non-cognitive assessment, emotions and affect, attitude in mathematics education, and today she will be talking about instructional feedback. In her keynote, Paradox of Feedback, if we don't know where we are going, how will we know when to get there? She will take us along in the underlying mechanisms and educational outcomes of instructional feedback from both the provider's and the recipient's perspective. She will provide us instructional tools on fostering self-feedback generation, and I wish you a very nice keynote. Enjoy Anna's talk on instructional feedback.
Buenos días. Muchas gracias, Lauri, por esta introducción y muchas gracias por estar aquí. I'll not do my presentation in Spanish. And I'll start, before I dive into the discussion of instructional feedback, I'll tell you a quick personal story and a story about titles. Okay? So about 5 years ago, I was invited to give a keynote at a conference in East Asia, and I submitted the title of my presentation and then immediately received an email asking me to please revise my title to make it more exciting. And you know, it's not that I wasn't aware of my lackluster skills of producing really exciting titles. I'm decent at, you know, those boring descriptive ones, but those catchy, no. So when Lauri came to me in January of 2020 and asked me for the title of this talk, I remember my blood pressure going up and my pumps sweating, and I thought I really need to do a good job here because I would not, you know, survive the second request for more exciting titles. So I came up with this gem right here. The paradox of feedback, if we don't know where we're going, how will we know that we got there? So the excitement is present, but then if you recall, shortly after, we all entered that period of insane shared deconstruction of our existence with lockdowns, travel bans, compulsive sourdough bread baking. And then when the conference was back on, I looked at the conference website and I saw this title and I realized that I have absolutely no idea what is it that I wanted to say. So, I mean, it's obviously about feedback, but the underlying deep idea, no idea. So what I'm going to do in this talk is the next best thing, which is my attempt, possibly futile, at retrofitting what I want to tell you today into the title that I produced 2.5 years ago. All right? So what I can promise you is a lot of empirical research, a lot of studies with a lot of paradoxical effects, and I hope you agree that some of those effects are paradoxical, and some direction in general where we're going with the research group and where we might go as a field. And I hope we'll have a discussion, fruitful discussion at the end. So I know I'm preaching to the converted. So I don't need to work really hard trying to convince you that feedback is everywhere. That every single day we engage in the multitude of feedback exchanges, from a very quick comment on the shoes that you are wearing to a more comprehensive evaluation of our fellow drivers' driving skills that we deliver through the window on the traffic light. Right? So if I asked you right now to think about a situation in which you really wanted to get feedback, okay? And then about a situation in which you could really do away without feedback. So this it's probably easy for you to come up with those examples because really it's not universal, because this receptivity to feedback and our desire to receive it is very situation dependent. And also, some people are generally more willing to receive feedback across situations, and there are some who really dread it or not kind of hesitant about it. So instructional context is in no way different. So in educational programs are permeated with feedback exchanges. We have peer interactions, teacher formal assessments. We have, computer-provided feedback. And at this point, compendiums of studies and meta-analysis have already convinced us that feedback is one of the most effective interventions. We can argue ad nauseum about the magnitude of effect sizes, but we do know that feedback can have a really powerful effect on students' emotions, cognition, behavior, and ultimately their performance. And it's our job as a field to harness this power of instructional feedback. So in thinking, what really goes into this complex dance of feedback, which for the location it will be the complex flamenco of feedback, right? So my colleague Jeff Smith and I had a lot of ideas. So we were trying to describe what goes into student feedback interaction. So we had something, oh no, actually I'm going to go into definition, sorry. So let's define first. And right here, I'm already stepping on a slippery slope, okay? Because David is nodding already. Because we can spend the entire conference and then 2 additional ones trying to agree on the definition of feedback, and it will still probably not work. So the definition that I'm providing here is the one that I came up with my colleague Jeff Smith, and it also comes from my recent work with Ernesto Panadero. So this one is a compounded definition, intentionally very broad. So here I defined instructional feedback as any information related to a performance that students can use to improve their performance, learning, and individual characteristics. And this is an important point. The information is expected to have a stronger effect if it encourages students to engage in active processing. Okay? So this is no different from any other instructional intervention. So if you have the most phenomenal lecture that you're delivering to your students, it will only be useful for the students if they actively engage with it. So we also contend that any feedback, if processed, culminates in this self-directed feedback message. So I'm going to talk about this. We kind of started discussing in the morning about self-directed feedback, so I'm going to dwell on it a little bit more later in the presentation. So when reviewing the field, we can see that in the past, take a step back a couple of decades, we only focused on teachers as providers of feedback. Most of the literature had to do with how teachers deliver, how they should deliver feedback. And then this research pendulum kind of swung towards students as active agents, users, and recipients of feedback. And it's an important shift, but we would like to emphasize, and it's not a royal we, it's me and my colleagues, so we think that focus should be on both the provider and the recipient of feedback. Because yes, the good feedback is the one that gets used by the students, but it's up to us, the instructors, to structure the instructional activities and instructional supports in such a way that students can actually use that feedback. And also the actual feedback message matter also. What kind of information you provide to the student is really critical in the way they take it. And hopefully I'll convince you with some of the studies that I report. I'll be taking sips of water because I'm severely dehydrated for whatever reason. So this is what, I started my conversation already about the organization of our ideas before, but then we clean them up into something that looks like this. So it's much more aesthetically pleasing and much more, hopefully, understandable. So this is a student feedback interaction model that Jeff Smith and I proposed in 2016, and then we recently revised it. This paper is currently in press. So I'm going to very quickly walk you through the model, and then I'm going to report results of empirical studies that illustrate each of the components of this model. So feedback happens in a context, and context greatly affects how the feedback will be taken. So if you're thinking about online environment, if you're thinking about in-person, face-to-face interaction, it's very different. By the way, it's great, like feeling this energy, 3D people, amazing. Same goes for feedback. Additionally, when we talk about context, we talk about cultural environment. We also talk about domain, academic domain. So context is defined very broadly here. Then we go into the source. So the exact same message from the teacher, the computer, the peer will be perceived very differently and will be implemented very differently. And my colleagues who do a lot of research in peer assessment, Jan Willem, right there on the left, we have Ernesto Panadero here, will probably agree with me. The exact same message that comes from the teacher and the peer will be taken, processed, and implemented very differently. Then we get to the actual feedback message, and we spend so much time at the field, and we know so much more at this point that differences, even slight differences in the actual message that we deliver to the student, again, affects the way this message is processed. And there are some effects that intrigue me, keep me up at night very often. And I'm going to share them with you, and hopefully you will agree that they are quite paradoxical, because you see me making references to the title. Then we get into the learner, and the learner is the most, I guess, interesting and intriguing part of this whole model, and this at the center of it. So we have learners with their individual characteristics. So we have different level of performance, we have different level of knowledge, motivation, personality, and all of these characteristics alone and in combination would inevitably affect the way a feedback message is processed. And now we are getting to the most interesting, kind of the mechanism, the core, the meat of this model. So it's the ABC of processing. So we have affective, behavioral, and cognitive processing. And we, for the purposes of illustration, describe them with the following questions. So cognitive processing, a student is supposed to answer, do I understand this feedback? Affective processing, how do I feel about this feedback? And then behavioral processing, do I know what to do with this feedback? Okay? So the answers to this question correspond to self-feedback. So, and students act in the end on that self-feedback. So, okay, I understand, I know what to do, I like it, therefore I implement it. And then this self-feedback message may affect differentially the outcomes. And outcomes is also a very complicated beast, because in the field of feedback, we focus a little bit too much on student perceptions. Okay, so using student perceptions as outcome may be a tricky business, because we humans are in general very irrational, and we often like things that are not good for us, more often than not. Okay, there are lots of nods right here. Then having some performance outcomes, so learning outcomes, or studying transfers to similar tasks, this is an important area that we kind of should be working on. And then this loop continues. Okay, so this is a basic walk through the model. So let's look at the components a little bit closer. Context. So as I said, context matters greatly. And again, the problem that I see sometimes, and I fall into the trap, when you're trying to write an introduction for a paper and you don't have studies that come from your sample, right, from your developmental level, you go to the next available study that was conducted probably on the psychology students, first-year psychology students, and then you make generalizations to the sample that you're using. And this may not be okay, and I'll explain to you why. And then in some cases, again, face-to-face context, we make generalization to the digital context. Or here, I'm going to show you a completely different instructional context, and this is the context of massive open online courses. I just like this cute bear, so it has nothing to do with the feedback. It kind of has to do with the climate change. So in this experimental study, my colleague and a former student, Maria Gianelli, we were approached by Coursera, which is one of the largest providers of massive open online courses, and we were asked to do studies on testing and feedback. So we went and we explored, we looked into the work of Bjork Lab, Learning and Forgetting Lab, and they do a lot of research into pretest. So they show amazing effects of pretest as primers. So you administer a pretest, it primes students, direct their attention towards the information that is useful, and then at the end, great things happen. And we thought that if we look at those pretests with feedback, oh my goodness, we'll find amazing results. So the context of MOOCs is really different simply because the average attrition is between 92 to 97%. So we started with over 6,000 participants, ended up with 600. And the design of the study, just the basic outline of the study, I'm not going to bore you with a lot of methodological details. It was a 5-week course, 1 module per week. At the end of each module, students had to take a post-test. And then we had the following conditions. So control group only had the post-test. The first experimental group had pre-test without any feedback. Then the second experimental group had pre-test with basic feedback, correct and correct. And then the third experimental group had pre-test with elaborate feedback. So with elaborate feedback, every answer, and it was a multiple choice test, was explained. So it was a mini instructional episode. So we explained why answer A was better or worse than answer B, and so on. So what do you think we found? Any predictions? Who did the best? Number one. Close enough. Close, Reinhard. No differences in post-test whatsoever. So it didn't matter pre-test, feedback, it didn't affect post-test in any way. So, and that made us pause. It made us realize that context does affect things. So we shouldn't be making generalizations about pretty much anything, any instructional tools, because it's not how it works in traditional settings. But then interesting, and Reinhardt is close, kind of warm. Course attrition. We looked at course attrition by condition, and here I think the results are also quite interesting. So we found that attrition was the highest for the pre-test with no feedback, but control group, they stayed, most of them they had the lowest attrition out of all groups. So, exactly, the effects are paradoxical. Thank you, Kathleen. So, students apparently were frustrated with pre-tests, and they were especially frustrated with pre-tests when they received no information on their performance. So again, the findings of this study just I think it's a great, very illustrative example that the context of MOOC is very different from a traditional setting, that the effects of that come from a traditional setting shouldn't be generalized to MOOCs or any other different settings, and vice versa. And students, our explanation for this is that students had such limited prior knowledge that they didn't have a basis onto which they could append information that came through our fabulous, elaborate feedback. And also, they couldn't really use, the pretest. They couldn't be primed because they had absolutely no information. We subsequently conducted MOOC study episode 2, and we're currently in the process of data analysis, and maybe if we have time, I can show you additional results when we're looking at practice tests. But right now, we're moving into the source of feedback. And here, I'm going to talk to you, combine the source of feedback and the feedback message and show you how this combination works differentially and how it differentially affects students' performance. So this is probably one of my favorite studies. If every researcher has the favorite studies, this would be mine. I conducted it a long time ago, and I think I learned a lot from it. It stimulated a lot of subsequent research, and I hope you agree that, again, the findings are paradoxical, intriguing, and interesting. So the source of feedback, we looked at how students perceive feedback with an understanding that the feedback came from the computer and the instructor, the exact same feedback, just the perception that we varied. And we looked at the following types of feedback: grades, praise, and detailed comments. All right, these are the most common types of feedback that students receive in a typical classroom setting. So we wanted to see how they operate individually and in combination. So it was an experiment with those famed psychology students, first-year psychology students, but there were many of them, so we could do some cool methodological manipulations. We also had focus groups. So the design was students came into a computer lab, worked on the exam, so it was a consequential exam. Then they came back 1 week later, and they revised their essay based on the feedback that was provided to them. And we had 12 conditions, right? So we had a 3x2x2 design in which we had no feedback, then student feedback that came from the computer, feedback that came from the instructor, and crossed with grade and praise. So the results, okay? We found that students in the no feedback performed significantly worse than those in either computer and instructor condition. Very optimistic finding. So it means that when you provide students with a lot of comments and then offer them opportunity to revise or encourage and threaten them with a bad grade, they are capable of implementing those comments. But that's not the most interesting finding here. So the most interesting finding has to do with the actual combination of grades and praise. So in the no feedback condition and in the computer condition, it didn't really matter if you added grades, if you added praise. So the performance within those groups, the differences were not statistically significant. Okay, there were no simple effects. But then if you look at the instructor condition, you see this discrepancy in scores. So the two highest performing groups in the whole study out of 12 conditions were students who received instructor comments without grades, okay? And then the group that performed out of instructor, in the 4 groups in the instructor condition, the group that received instructor comments and the grade, they performed almost as poorly as students who received no feedback. So this was an intriguing finding because, you know, what is about the grade? What is the grade? And I know Reinhardt is here doing a lot of research with grades and emotions. So grade has a strong emotional effect on students. So we found that, for example, grade affects brings students' negative effect higher, that grade also decreases motivation to engage in revisions. So the summary of this study is that source matters, that students did better when they thought that feedback came from the instructor, that the type of feedback matters, that detail-specific comments obviously work, grades are not effective, praise appears to mitigate, kind of offset this negative effect of grades. But again, students need feedback and the opportunity to revise, okay? So moving on, I'm kind of zooming through into individual characteristics. And here, again, we know so much. We know that students, just this morning, Juan presented a study and showed that students of higher ability, they respond differently to rubrics and scripts. And we know so much about feedback already that, again, ability, prior experience, motivation, self-efficacy, all these characteristics may affect the way feedback is processed. And I would like to show you an example of one construct that we started work on this construct a while ago. So it's receptivity to instructional feedback. So remember in the beginning I suggested that there may be people who are generally more receptive of feedback. So we tried to investigate if it really was the case, if we could find evidence, support to that. So we propose that receptivity to instructional feedback has 4 factors. The first one, experiential attitudes. It's your enjoyment. It's your affective kind of factor. Then instrumental attitudes, the value of feedback, whether a person sees the value in the use of feedback. Cognitive engagement, whether they know, whether they understand the feedback. And then behavioral engagement, whether they have strategies, whether they know what to do with the feedback when it comes to them. At this point, we collected lots and lots of data, and we are showing that these 4 factors differentially predict grades, vary by gender, and then, Rianska, we just had a conversation about the big 5. We always worry about jingle-jangle, not to further jingling and jangling our already messy, conceptually messy field, not introduce additional constructs unless it's absolutely necessary. So we included personality, and across multiple samples, we looked at links between receptivity, our receptivity factors, and personality. And we are finding that the correlations are quite low and they're differential, so we're not simply reproducing facets of the big 5 personality dimensions. And we also replicated the study in the receptivity. We supported the structure of the scale in 4 countries, USA, Spain, New Zealand, and Singapore, and currently collecting data in Iran and Turkey and Colombia. And we are planning, so why do we care about this? Okay, so if we administer, what we're trying to do in Singapore right now, we administer this scale, and then at the group level, at the class level, analyze the lower scores, so we see where students have some sort of deficiencies, and we design class-based interventions to enhance the value of feedback, to teach specific strategies for cognitive, affective, and behavioral engagement. So possibly these individual characteristics, this moderating variable and this link between feedback and performance, student performance, is really worthy of attention. So we really invested in this line of research. But again, individual characteristics matter. There are many more that we can discuss. Now processing. And processing, again, I can spend the whole week talking about processing alone. I will start with cognitive processing. Okay? So one of the newer studies that is currently being ready for submission, and a few additional ones, we started working on biases, cognitive biases. Because if you think about it, when the student selects which feedback they take, which feedback they dismiss, they make decisions. And we know that in any domain of our lives, our decisions are affected by a number of cognitive biases. And there are currently not many studies, empirical studies, at least we don't know of any, that investigated how these biases manifest in the process of feedback receptivity. So how do they appear? So we decided to look, we started with the anchoring bias. And again, this morning I was joking about my provenance from the United States, because when I first came, I'm an Eastern European, and came to the United States, one of the shocking aspects about feedback was that everyone starts with praise, right, Chris? It's a lot of exuberance, and it's great. It's actually quite contagious, and it's nice, but this praise statement, and even as a mother, my children always receive this strong praise statement followed by, you know, here is what you need to do, kind of deal. And this feedback sandwich, right, we know it as a feedback sandwich in work psychology and industrial organizational psychology, but then looking through studies, there is nothing that shows that it's actually effective. So I started thinking about anchoring bias, and that an anchoring bias is our tendency to interpret all the subsequent information through the prism of this first incoming piece of information. So if you greet a student with praise, then everything else that comes later gets interpreted through this additional, through this initial praise statement. So we used the exact same design that we are so familiar with. So we did write, revise, resubmit. Some students received very detailed comments. Other students, we had a control group, and then one of the groups received praise on top of it. And here is what we found. We found that students who received praise and comments did worse than those who received comments only. And motivation was lower for the praise plus comments group. Okay, so it so appears that that praise does elicit this anchoring bias. So maybe starting with the praise statement is not that great of an idea. Maybe you should save praise until the end of the unit. And there is initial evidence in actually parenting research. So studies show that this even cursory remark, "Oh, you're doing great, sweetheart," interrupts children's engagement with the task. So we really need to wait until the end, unless you are engaged in some kind of behavior modification and you need to really reinforce that particular behavior. So be careful with praise. Praise is a really complicated type of feedback. I also wanted to point at the study that Rob Nash and Naomi Winstone here conducted to illustrate what we know and how we study cognitive processing. So they conducted 6 experiments in which they looked at the recall of evaluative versus directive feedback, and they found that across all 6 experiments, evaluative feedback was recalled much better. So my plea to our community of feedback researchers is to investigate what does it mean practically. Does it mean that we need to rephrase our feedback into evaluative statements? Does it translate into better behaviors? These are the answers that we are looking at at the moment. So it's important to study cognitive processing, but then kind of put it into the applied context as well, right? Now I'm getting into emotions. And I'm not going to torture you by presenting a model within a model within a model, but we recently submitted a manuscript in which we looked at links between feedback and emotions, and we examined all the possible moderators and mediators of this relationship, and it's steeped in Reinhardt's control value theory of emotions, which, by the way, Reinhardt was the first one, to my knowledge, to actually explicitly mention feedback as one of the most important antecedents of emotions. So we looked at all the moderators and mediators, and I'm not going to present too many studies here. I'll just mention a few. I'll just tell you that with feedback, emotions run wild. As I already mentioned, for example, grade really gets people sad, guilty, ashamed if it's lower than expected, or even proud. We've shown through a number of studies that pride is elicited, and then any strong emotion by default would take away from the task in which a student is engaged. There are also studies by Anturk, and we are conducting a similar study with my student on feedback. So we're showing that bored teachers provide lower grades and harsher feedback. So links between emotions and feedback go that way as well. We know that feedback elicits differential emotions, and again, in our work, we show that emotions mediate this feedback performance links. So now we're getting to the outcomes. And with outcomes, again, as I mentioned, it's really difficult to study transfer, right? So there are two indices of memory. There is storage strength and retrieval strength. So ideally, we would know what feedback does to both of these indices. Currently in the field, again, we focus a little bit too much on student perceptions of feedback and also performance on tasks. So many of the studies that I reported to you, it's just performance on this specific task. But then how does it affect long-term learning? These are the questions that we are asking ourselves. So questions for you and questions for all of us that we are thinking about, it's what does it all mean for educators? Okay, what kind of feedback should we provide? Is it really realistic to provide that kind of feedback? What is the bare minimum? And is there a way to give excellent feedback and stay sane? So those of you who came into our morning session, I already touched upon it. I went into greater detail, but I'm going to mention kind of the direction of our work in this domain because, yeah, as I said this morning, it's not uncommon for me because I'm not a procrastinator, I'm an incubator. It's all about reframing, right? So I incubate my desire to grade, I guess, it doesn't work as well. And then in the middle of the night, I'm sitting and providing feedback on PhD students' proposals, and Carolina is nodding because sometimes I send emails at 5 o'clock in the morning questioning my life choices and rethinking my existence. But so we need to come up with better ways, right? So we need to come up with alternative ways. So we're not going away from teachers providing feedback. There will still be place for that, but what can we do to kind of help the teacher stay sane? So we conducted several studies in which we used instructional tools that are already popular and very kind of reasonably well studied. So we looked at rubrics and exemplars and tried to see whether they can be used for self-feedback generation. And Anders is right there. He just chaired a great session on rubrics. So we had two tasks in this case, kind of going back to the outcomes. So this is the study in which we can actually make connections and make conclusions about transfer to a different task, okay? So we had 2 rounds of write, revise, and resubmit, and what we did in this study, we had students write an essay, and then we assigned them to groups of rubrics, exemplars, a combination and the control. So we provided them with these instructional tools after they wrote their initial draft. So it's a similar way in what we do with feedback, right? In feedback comments, when the teacher writes and provides feedback. So you write a draft, and then you receive a rubric, an exemplar, and then you encourage the students to actually engage with it and generate self-feedback. So here are our fabulous little charts and our findings in a nutshell. So we had 3 outcomes for reading, writing, and analysis on this task, and it was a standardized task for college entrance examination. And we found here that at time 2, which is revision on the first task, rubrics group did really well. So it outperformed all the other groups. Then we conducted training on how to use rubrics and exemplars for students. And then we looked at what happened. And what happened was that the 3 experimental conditions for one of the outcome variables, which is the reading, they outperformed the control group, but their performance was not better compared to task 1. Okay? For the writing, rubrics group did outperform the other 3 conditions, and they also did better than they did on the initial round. So there was some evidence of transfer already. And then we can also see that for the analysis, all 3 groups performed significantly better than what they did at time 1. So there is, again, this, I don't know, it makes me happy. Does it make you happy? That there is some evidence of transfer, that what we do with our feedback provision, with our usage, very mindful and meaningful usage of the tools that we give to our students, that they actually improve and they retain that. So it's not just on this task we saw the improvement, that it actually went somewhere, that they got something out of it. So ultimately at time 4, we had also exemplars that approached the performance of rubrics. So they did really well, and I think the circle, it's actually on writing, it's only rubrics. But rubrics and exemplars can be used to save instructors time, so consider this strategy. And with my PhD class, I often do this approach, so I have students self-assess and provide feedback, and then provide feedback to the peer, and then in the end, I still come in with my comments. So there can be a sequence to this. This study, I don't know about you, but it is quite paradoxical. So our team member recently completed this study in Brazil. So she looked at students' essays, and she provided detailed comments. 2 instructors provided detailed comments on students' drafts, and then they designed an exemplar, an annotated exemplar, saying, so this is a good essay because the opening is great, the idea is developed, the conclusion is excellent. And then they offered them 2 students after they submitted the first draft, and we found that there was no difference between the teacher condition and the annotated exemplar condition. Okay, so the average time per essay was 12 minutes, and the average time for exemplar, and there were 3 of them, was 20 minutes. So we are saving an insane amount of time when we do that. Okay, so these are, I think, some promising results on our road to preserve our sanity. So what does it all mean? This part of the presentation, I would like to say to emphasize this importance of encouraging students to generate self-feedback. So it's a viable strategy, it works, and maybe it would be a good idea to invest more time to figure out how and when and under what circumstances it's best to use these techniques, to use these instructional tools, and maybe employ others. So David Nichol studies comparators. He's running this whole research agenda right now, looking at various comparators and how they affect performance. Suzanne Narcisse studies internal feedback and how students really use it, what kind of message they're telling themselves, and which one is the most effective. So exemplars, rubrics, and other tools that encourage student self-feedback generation work well and save our time. So now I would like to go into a kind of completely different field. So when we talk about rubrics and exemplars and self-feedback generation, we often say that we would like our students to not depend on us as feedback providers, to not depend on various tools, right? So we want them to be independent, self-regulated agents. But is it really realistic to expect our students to not need our feedback? So when I was reading all this literature on feedback, I went into the medical field. That's why I was so excited, Rianska, about your talk yesterday. The medical field is teeming with amazing studies on feedback, and we, Kathleen, this cross-pollination should be happening, all over. So in medical field, I found this study conducted by a researcher from the University of Florida, Erickson and team. They studied radiologists and surgeons. Okay, and they found that for radiologists, years of experience didn't relate or even negatively predicted successful diagnosis. It's kind of scary. Now I need to know who my radiologist is before I, take the diagnosis. And then for surgeons, years of experience positively predicted successful outcomes. Okay, interesting. Do you have any ideas why? What would be your explanation? You know the answer. Not quite. And that was the paradoxical finding. Thank you. Exactly. Lack of feedback. So the researchers explained this different with the lack of feedback, because currently, especially with the digitization of medicine, radiology is a very solitary activity, occupation. So they're basically at home, they're looking at the slides, at the film, and there it's again, as Margaret said, it's a pattern recognition, so they're just sitting there. They do not get any feedback. It's not like in the past the doctors stood together and looked at them like they show in the movies. They don't do that anymore. So it's a single person looking at the slides, not getting any feedback, and in many cases they don't know if their diagnosis was correct or incorrect. Whereas for surgeons, it's an ongoing feedback, because when they are, when the patient is dying, you get an immediate feedback. And then you have a team of people right next to you standing there and saying, oh, no, you're cutting the wrong organ. And then you have post-op check-ins, right? So you get a lot of feedback. So in this case, I think I read it all too often, and I'm guilty of saying it. So our ultimate goal is to have students not to rely on our feedback, but maybe it shouldn't be our ultimate goal, because in the end, everyone needs feedback at all times, especially for things that matter. Now, again, I don't know what you make of this study. I would like to hear your ideas, because it kind of bothers me now that if I ever need to go to a radiologist. So in terms of future directions, I would like to encourage the field to conduct methodologically strong empirical studies. For example, a few ideas. Inter-individual differences in feedback processing. Okay? Combining cognitive science and emotions research to examine how feedback interacts with effective study and instructional strategies. To examine cognitive load and decision making to harness the effects of feedback, because again, the cognitive load, that's another area of research that we are currently doing with Carolina Lopera here. So it's really important how much feedback you provide, in what conditions you provide, and how it really may affect your cognitive load. By the way, the findings about rubrics and exemplars, it's quite possible that the combination condition, it was a huge cognitive load. So they just had too much information to juggle, and as a result, they didn't improve. And in general, helping teachers by offering research-driven feedback guidelines. Because when I go into professional development, again, teachers need specific answers. And in many cases, I cannot give them specific answers, and maybe we shouldn't, suggest things that are not well researched, because, for example, now the question that concerns teachers quite a bit is the timeliness of feedback. Right, so there was a giant study conducted, it's a multi-university study that was conducted by 5A and company, and they recently showed that the timing of feedback on complex tasks doesn't really matter. So it's a giant relief for some of us, again, incubators, right? So the students do not immediately need to receive that feedback. So studies like that are really useful, and I encourage you to conduct them. And now a consideration. In thinking and reviewing the field, I keep finding parallels with discovery learning versus direct instruction approach. So we went through a phase when it was all about discovery learning, right? The constructivist approaches all the way, and I'm, by the way, a born constructivist because I come from Belarus, and Vygotsky was born in Belarus. So Belarusians are really proud of our ownership of Vygotsky. So it's not that I'm not a constructivist. So discovery learning was raging, and typical lecture, it's not good. Everything has to be discovered and explored. But then Paul Kirchner, right? We all read that review. So and many others that followed and preceded. So we know that a carefully designed lecture is a very effective use of encouraging students, motivating students, helping them learn. So maybe in the field of feedback, I have a feeling sometimes that we are going too far to this discovery learning field. So let's help our students explore and discover and ask us for feedback. So all those things are important, but they have place, but they shouldn't replace us, teachers, instructors, as careful thinkers about how to deliver feedback, when to deliver, and what kind of feedback to deliver. So here I'll leave you with this idea. So good feedback is the kind of feedback that is used by students, but only good feedback that is offered under right conditions will be used and generated. Okay? And this is it.
Thank you so much, Anna, for taking us along in your elaborate model, but I think you did a terrific job.
Thank you.
So inspiring. I'm sure there are many questions and reflections on those paradoxical findings, so shoot.
Thank you. With the title. Yes. Oh.
I'd like to ask a question about the use of language in feedback research and how it might be limiting the things that we focus on. Particularly at the earlier part of your presentation, you've used the word feedback to refer to feedback messages, but you're also using it to refer to feedback processes. And I find this very confusing. I mean, I'd much like us to separate out the notion of an input from the processes, because we know from the basic sciences that feedback is not the input. And we need to be careful as educators that we don't fall into the error of associating the input of feedback processes with the whole process. And if we were more careful with our language, we might focus more on the other elements of the feedback process that are needed for it to be effective.
As I said, I was stepping on a very slippery slope by going into definitions to begin with. I don't think that our definition is limiting in any way. I don't think by defining feedback as information, we are focusing less on processes of feedback. So to me, again, this message, so if I provide feedback on student's paper, and then the student doesn't look at it. So is it feedback or is it not? To me, it's definitely feedback.
Why should we do something different from the history of feedback in the sciences in education? Because in the history of sciences and the way that engineering works now, the input is not feedback. It has to be completed in a process that has an effect for us to label it feedback. Teachers provide information to students, and for me, they're not engaged in a feedback process until
I don't know if anyone would like to contribute to this discussion. So I don't think, again, my focus, I never felt that by defining feedback as information limited my research into students' processing of it. And this is basically the focus of my entire career, and this is what my team is working on. So I don't mind if, the distinction between feedback information versus feedback process. What I really do mind, I, for example, disagree strongly with the statement that feedback is only feedback unless it's used and implemented and used for the greater good. I disagree with that. We had a hand, Ernesto. Because exactly.
I think you will first.
I just thought I would change the conversation. I was at that conference. We spent a day and a half. May I respectfully suggest it is one of the paradoxes of feedback in this conversation. I wanted to ask if you had any thoughts on the ground people who work with feedback. And I know that feedback is a process, but it doesn't matter. So I don't care how much. Because what I'm trying to say is that there are lots and lots of messages, and lots of paradoxes. What will your everyday teaching?
It's an excellent question. So when I do professional development, again, with teachers, so I usually, the summary message, and I think I even have it. So context does matter. That feedback message that we as teachers provide, we should be really mindful at what we say, how much we say. So praise, at this point, I can already share a lot of information about praise. For example, for the US context, it's very relevant, and teachers usually appreciate this information. The provision of praise in the beginning of the unit is not a good idea. Provision of grades in write, revise, and resubmit is also not a good idea, because students do not use feedback when you accompany it with the grade. As my father said, it's not interesting to watch the game when you know the outcome of the game, right? So students don't use it. Then in terms of complexity of feedback, so again, it should be just right. And I know that I'm not giving this prescription. What is just right? So again, and here individual characteristics come into play. So the age, the context, the gender. So for example, we're finding that girls are more receptive to feedback on average across countries. So you need to, again, we as instructors need to structure our activities in such a way that students live in this culture of feedback, that feedback is not something threatening or something that is going to hurt them. It's something that's going to help them. This value of feedback should be communicated from the very beginning. And again, use of being creative, like use of exemplars and rubrics and annotated exemplars. It could be a useful strategy. Okay. So, okay, I'm not going to interfere, sorry.
Thank you for this brilliant overview.
talk about teachers, peers, the computer, and other persons as context, right? What about the broader institutional context? So let's say different schools that differ in terms of instructional climate and feedback climate. And what about different cultures? You did research in different cultures, in different countries, right? And I mean, I assume that there are differences in the feedback practices between, let's say, at least some East Asian countries and some Western countries. So how would you conceptualize these differences and maybe, I mean, aim to expand your framework in the years to come to include cultural impact?
It's actually, Rankert, a really great question, and it's a side effect of my poor design skills in terms of PowerPoint presentation. I think I spent a lot of time on this. I hope there were some cool fly-ins and all that stuff and pictures and visuals. But that model, it actually context underlies the whole model. So context is not the source. So the source is a separate block. So the context relates to cultural context. It relates to whether it's face-to-face or online environment, whether it's a massive open online course, consequential, non-consequential tasks. So I do include it in the paper. It's all included and discussed. And in terms of cultural differences, it's absolutely striking. This is one of my favorite jobs. This is one of the reasons why I like traveling and visiting other universities, because you go to other countries and you realize how strikingly different feedback culture is. I remember I was doing professional development in one of the East Asian countries, and a teacher asked me, Professor Lipnevich, when I write rubbish on students' essay, what kind of feedback is that? And I said, it's a rubbish kind of feedback, basically. Because what else can you say? So I'm just thinking this wounded child that's emotionally traumatized. So, and then you go to the opposite, you get to the US where you get so much praise. In Eastern Europe, it's kind of, everything is kind of lukewarm, kind of, okay, So feedback culture does differ, so we can take what we learn from different cultures and implement it in where we currently reside. And I'm, by the way, very non-Eastern European. Yes.
Let's go to the laptop first. They're waiting since the
Okay, I'm not. Sorry. Is it biased? So there are multiple components to this question. So in general, what's the goal of feedback? And we have an amazing review, right? Some pitching of our reviews. We recently published a review with Ernesto Panadero, and we review the models, and we do this analysis of functions of feedback. And then I think Nacho here is going to present tomorrow all the different functions of feedback that teachers report. So what is our goal? I don't know. I think we all have the same goal. We want to help our students learn. We want to help them improve on a task. We want to help them learn, have some kind of long-term, right? Some kind of forming memory traces so that the performance on this task will be generalized to the next one. We also want to develop students as learners. So there can also be feedback on psychosocial characteristics. So this is another area that we are currently researching. But in terms of anchoring bias, I'm not sure what. No, it's in general. It's a function of our decision making, right? So there is a vast area of research in cognitive psychologists into cognitive biases, and there is a confirmation bias. There are so many other biases besides anchoring. So it doesn't mean that it's not a bias in a kind of traditional kind of sense. Anchoring bias, again, it means that we take the first piece of information and interpret everything through the prism of it. So it's your role as a teacher to decide what you want first. So if a student is really struggling and you think presenting this praise statement is critically important, it's going to elevate positive effect and it's going to motivate the student, think twice, because motivation apparently drops after the praise. At least that's what we're finding in our study, and we're going to replicate it, so we'll see if this effect persists. So again, it's students do what they do, but it's directly related to the kind of feedback message that they receive.
I think she was first.
So I want to start with praise.
Thank you. That's a question. Again, I have my student Carolina Lopera here. We are designing a teacher evaluation, redesigning what our university is doing in terms of teacher evaluation, and we place a really important chunk of that evaluation will be on feedback to the instructor. What kind of feedback we as instructors want from students? So we are trying to explore that area right now. So I don't have anything to report to you, but we are currently working on that project. But praise was perfectly acceptable because it's the end of the unit, you know, so it's...
Kathleen was next.
Thank you for the stimulating.
Thank you.
I note that praise seems to be a key focus of paradoxical findings here. And so I wonder if you might want to just elaborate a little bit about praise, because we know that there are different kinds of praise. You can praise the product or you can praise the process, for example. And we know from some of Carol Dweck's work that those kinds of distinctions matter. So can you just say a little bit more about how you work that into?
Yeah, we recently completed a review on praise, so all the variables that are affected by praise, and we conducted this review in educational setting, also in parenting and in counseling. I think it's doing something. No, good. And in counseling work as well. So the praise, again, it's very complicated. And in fact, Dweck recently, a colleague of mine, Eddie Brommelman, so I think he's from the Netherlands, he published a book on praise. And Dweck contributed a number of chapters, and they use this term paradoxical effects of praise throughout the book. Because there are, from study to study, praise operates in a really strange manner. So for example, in our studies, we found that praise, even an opening statement like, you are doing great, this is an excellent draft. It's not anything specific, it's not anything that relates to the actual performance, it's a generic statement. Even that statement alone decreases students' motivation and they are not engaging in the task. At the same time, praise has its value, so it elevates positive effect. Okay, and then what else did we find? It, again, mitigates the effects of grades. So if you must provide the grade, you might as well attach some praising on top of it to kind of cancel out the negative effect of grades. In terms of process versus product and the moment of praise, so Dweck says that the process praise should lead to kind of improvement, so there are some usages to that. But then again, I begin to worry because I haven't conducted any studies quite yet on that, but the timing of the praise is something that I always think about, and now I think, you know, just a personal example, I have my child, right? So he comes home and he says, I got 100% on my Spanish test. And I tell him, great job, see, you studied so well. And I'm trying to do the dweck effort. And he says, no, I lost the description, I didn't prepare at all. And then here I am thinking like, oh my goodness, what do I do in this situation? I need to really reinforce this. I'm like, because you read so many books and do other wonderful things. That's why you did so well. So I'm like, whew, I recovered. So, so in some cases, again, it becomes really complicated delivering praise, and we need more work into that. Thank you.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. I looked at it. I was also at the previous session on rubrics, and there was some discussion about the fact that you gave the rubrics after the first round. And then I thought it was just methodological decision. Might it be that this actually helps learning? Because if you give the rubric beforehand, it's straightforward. If you give it afterwards, it's before plus feedback.
I really like this. I really like this way of thinking about it. Right? Yeah, so in our way, it was a methodological decision, but it really shows, because we haven't seen any effects, or we have a ton of rubric researchers right here. I don't think that the findings, the effect sizes we are finding with our studies when we present rubrics after the initial draft, we don't see that when we present rubrics in the beginning, right? Okay, so more to come. But it's interesting in the MOOC study, right, that I reported to you. So we used pre-test. This is, I'm just drawing parallels right here. So we did pre-tests that didn't work, but then when we did them as practice tests, kind of after the module, then they worked in an expected way. So there were some findings. So I like this way of, thank you. All the studies received IRB approval and human subjects approval from the City University. But yeah, in some cases we didn't have, the study that I didn't report, I mentioned it this morning, we didn't have a control group just because IRB wouldn't budge. But in our case, we always have a follow-up. So we usually give control students all the materials, they receive all the additional instructions. So in the end, they benefit, we take care of them. Because I do remember, I'm still haunted by the kind of image of this one student who said, but what do I do? He was in the control group, didn't get any feedback, and he looked at me and said, like, what do I do? I said, do your best, revise. But then, yes, so we provide our students, there is a final loop where we provide with all the materials, and we make sure that we take care of all of them. Exactly, thank you. I completely agree with this. Because again, David, I completely respect and appreciate your opinion, but again, I don't think that defining feedback through information is in any way limiting or has limited our research into these complex processes and this complex dance, flamenco again, between the teacher, the providers, the feedback message, and the outcomes.
I think at the top was first. Yeah.
I'm not at all a feedback researcher, but this is my personal experience or my background, but I'm still a bit hung up on this phrase feel this resistance of, oh my god, now nobody's going to give praise and positive feedback anymore. It's like, oh! And I was asking myself, it's also a question of how you define student success, because student success can be more than academic performance, but can also go into student well-being, for example. And if you define, because you had also in your model this emotional component, like, do I like the feedback that I give? And I hope that I lose them out and missed it at some point, but did you say anything about the emotional component of this? Because I strongly believe that this is also really important and shouldn't be neglected next to the pure academic performance outcome. And think about when you think about, I don't know, well-being and positive emotions, that how this influences the dynamic processes
It's actually the giant white model that I showed and kind of zoomed through it. This is all about feedback and emotions. And it's really important, and again, we have Reinhard Pekun here, who can attest that emotions, educational achievement emotions are very important. I do a lot of research into emotions, so we collaborate quite a bit. Yes, so it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And again, that's why I can't emphasize enough, and I think it's obvious, it's an obvious statement, that it's a really complex interplay. So if you, when you're working with the PhD students, you already know, one-on-one what each one of them needs. If one student needs more coddling, if one student doesn't need that, opening praise statement, right? So again, in this case, I'm in no way suggesting that you should stop giving praise. I'm just saying that maybe opening your feedback message with a praise statement is what shouldn't be done, at least from this little study. But for well-being, yes, absolutely. This is my other baby. My other area of research is actually psychosocial characteristics and how we can improve well-being. And through feedback, so we've actually designed, so I'm collaborating with College Board and Educational Testing Service, where we designed feedback kind of mechanism on providing feedback on psychosocial skills, how to make students happier, more self-efficacious, and how to report this information. So I fully appreciate, and I think it's a very important area that also needs a lot of research. How do we provide feedback on personality characteristics? So, yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much. There's so many dots that I'm trying to connect based on your presentation, and I'm excited about your last sentence. Are we going in the, you didn't say the wrong way, but are we stepping into this fall of going into this whole discovery thing? And I like the link with the Kirchner paper, because for me that was like revelating when I read it, and it really changed my mind. But there, I think, also is the paradoxical thing from our context in medical education. Within our programs, we want students to learn as much as possible, so we want this maybe more teacher-directed feedback, not all the discovery, but then your example showed that we cannot deliver the professionals that don't see the value, don't have the skills of feedback as professionals. And that's what I've been trying to fix in my mind, and I'm very curious to your thoughts about it, because we want them to learn in our programs, but we also want to prepare them to keep learning after they've left our programs, in our case for the sake of human health. So, and I think that's where the discovery comes in, because for me, the MOOC findings also show that students don't like it when learning is not fun. It's not fun when you're confronted with all the things you don't know yet. So you need to overcome this and stay open to feedback. But how do we prepare them in our programs?
That's a really complicated discussion. There are so many But I really appreciate this reflection, and I'm glad that my presentation stimulated it. I actually serve on the technical advisory board at the National Board of Medical Examiners in the United States. So people who prepare future doctors, medical professionals in the United States are also very much concerned with this idea of feedback, and more studies like Erickson's study are coming out. So even in your question, so you said that the lecture, you alluded to the fact that the lecture can be kind of not boring, but so when we prepare students through kind of discovery versus lectures, right? So we should do both of those things. So in the future, so encouraging students, this value of feedback, I think, again, sorry, I'm rambling. There are so many things to say, and there are more questions, and we're running out of time. Okay, with the, where was I?
Well, isn't it our role as teachers indeed to guide, to give good instruction, as you said, you ended with, it's us as teachers, we give the good instruction, but we also need to give the good instruction of how they keep learning after we are present.
Exactly. This is what we're trying to accomplish. So we want to, the lifelong learners, I think this is a kind of characteristic that every university statement has on their, opening website. So we are preparing lifelong learners. And I think through lectures and the discovery and good feedback provision, we can do that. But in terms of with the doctors, when we work with the doctors, to me, it's the value. It's the value of feedback. We keep emphasizing that here is empirical evidence, and I noticed that medical professionals respond very well to empirical data. So they need numbers. So show me. So if you're telling me that feedback is important, I don't care. Show me that it actually worked, that it actually changed something, and in the end, they do take it. Sorry.
Building on that, if we want to strengthen the direct approach in lecture, I'm a bit fussed by the pendulum, and you gave feedback, Richard, some feedback on a launched out. There's also the cognitive approach, and we are maybe forgetting about things that are useful there. But I think the solutions for strengthening the direct instruction approach with the takeaway messages that you bring will come from social constructivism, or am I understood correctly that comment?
I think, again, I don't think that I'm helping at this point. So it's a combination, right? So you need your direct instruction. There is a place for direct instruction. There is a place for discovery learning. There is a place for direct feedback provision from the teacher, the comments, and there is also a place for students, encouraging students to go and seek and ask and request in specific types of feedback. So one shouldn't be a substitute for the other. It's a combination of both. And I think, with the pendulum and kind of swinging over, I'm just seeing fewer and fewer studies from cognition and emotion, kind of hardcore cognitive and effective research. And I think we can learn a lot from there. And there are 50 more slides that are being hidden right now. There is one that we're working with Bjork Learning and Forgetting Lab, and I alluded to them. So they focus and they study ways in which this strength and retrieval strength and storage strength can be increased. And we're working on feedback, what type of feedback increases storage strength, or how well the information is stored, and how can we increase through feedback retrieval strength, the way the information is kind of available. So there are so many studies in cognitive science and, again, affective science that we can implement. But in terms of discovery versus direct instruction, there is a place for both.
Jan Willems next.
I did it with myself where I was going to together with discussion and topics of research midway, so I was like, okay. Today with myself, I want to post a review on maybe because maybe and also the content part of it.
Amen. Ab- Absolutely. I'm so looking forward to reading that paper. And we actually had conversations with both Ramaprasad and Sadler, and we discussed this tension. So we also report, I think we mentioned it in our paper with Ernesto Panadero. And I currently have a paper under review in which we looked at reasons why students do not take feedback. Okay, that's also kind of along the line, so we can discuss it.
Many questions left, but she's waiting a long time, so.
I'll be around. I'm not going anywhere. So it's just, yeah. I agree with you. I was also confused with that finding. But you know, it's interesting. At this point, we've replicated the effect in different educational, for different educational levels, starting from middle school, high school, undergrads, master's students, and it's consistent. But again, so in this case, we all know grades, nobody canceled grades. We're all getting, at least in most universities that I know, we always get a grade at the end. But then what I mean here, and we in many cases have to grade assignments or certain tasks. What I meant here about the grade and feedback is that point when you still can provide revisions. So when a student can still revise work. So at that midpoint, that's when grade really does not work. So if you think about the students, so I conducted focus groups with students, so I asked them to explain what's going on. And students said, so I got 85, and I was satisfied with the grade, and I just left. So a student, so there are 15 more points to 100, right? So a student who doesn't see that 85 and gets a lot of feedback would be inclined to implement that feedback because to them, this numerical score is not known. Whereas a student who sees 85 says, okay, this is fine by me, you know, it's already good enough. So they do not improve. So that's the main mechanism of grades. And in terms of lower grades, so lower than expected grades, then we get emotions. So students get upset, they feel ashamed and guilty and sad, and that takes up a lot of cognitive resources. And in many cases, they are not capable of improving their work. Sure.
Looking at the time, I think Anna will be around for the remaining questions throughout the conference, so don't hesitate to approach her. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you.
Thank you for such. Thank you.